Hi, I'm Christine from the Quilter's Retreat, and welcome back to our third video in our series of showing you how to make this sweet little keepsake baby quilt. In the last video, we finished the quilt top, and at that stage, we had what some quilters call a flimsy. It's a completed quilt top that's waiting to become a quilt. And today, we're going to turn this quilt top into an actual quilt. We'll layer it with batting and backing, and we're going to baste those layers together. We're going to quilt it with simple straight line quilting on a home machine. We're going to trim it and finish it up with binding. Now this first step is called making a quilt sandwich. It sounds a little funny, but it's exactly what it sounds like. 3 layers stacked together. That just means stacking the 3 layers together in the right order. The bottom layer is the backing. Place it right side down so the pretty side of the backing fabric faces the table or floor. The middle layer is the batting. That's the soft layer that gives the quilt warmth, texture, and that cozy quilt feeling. The top layer is the quilt top. Place it right side up so the part you pieced is facing you. You also want the backing and batting to be larger than the quilt top on all sides. That extra room gives you a little grace if the layers shift while you're basting and quilting. Now once the layers are stacked, smooth from the center outward. We want the quilt flat but not stretched. Then baste the layers together so they stay in place while you quilt. So remember, backing right side down, batting in the middle, quilt top right side up, and keep the backing and batting larger than the quilt top. So you're going to start by laying your backing fabric down first with the right side facing down. That means the pretty side is facing the table or the floor and the wrong side is facing up towards you. Now I just want to smooth the backing fabric. We want it flat, not stretched, and we can use painter's tape, as you see I've done here in the corners, to gently hold it in place. Next we're going to place the batting on top of the backing. Smooth it gently from the center outward. Batting can be a little clingy, so take your time. If there's wrinkles, lift and smooth rather than pushing it into the quilt. Don't tug because you may wind up tearing the batting. Now I like to use 100% cotton batting for baby quilts. It has a soft, natural feel, it washes up nicely, and it gives that quilt the crinkly texture many quilters love after washing. Now we're going to place the quilt top on top of the batting with the right side facing up. So our layers are backing right side down, batting in the middle, quilt top right side up. Then this is our quilt sandwich. So smooth the quilt from the center outward. Try not to stretch it. We're just helping the layers relax together. Now, before we baste, check that the backing and batting extend beyond the quilt top on every side. Now for this quilt, a few extra inches all the way around is plenty for home machine quilting. Now we need to baste the layers. Basting means temporarily holding the layers together so they don't shift while we quilt. Now for this quilt, I'm going to use safety pins. There are different ways that you can baste a quilt, but I prefer safety pins. It's just easier for me, and I don't like the hassle of having to deal with spray glue. Now there are different types of pins that you can use. One type is curved safety pins. These are helpful because they have a curve in them, which makes it easier to scoop through all 3 layers. But for me, I find them a bit too tough to close. But I prefer to use these longer, thin safety pins that I get from Walmart. They're a little bit bigger, so they're easier to handle, and they're quite thin, so they aren't so tough to get closed. But which pins you choose for your pin basting is a matter of preference. Try some different ones and choose the ones that work for you. You're going to see me use an assortment because that's what I have. Now you're going to start near the center of the quilt. You're going to place the pin through the quilt top, backing, and batting, and then close it carefully. Now work from the center outward, smoothing as you go. Now you want to place pins every few inches across the quilt. You don't need a pin every half inch, but you do want enough pins that the layers stay together as you move the quilt to the sewing machine, usually like a hand's width apart. Now don't worry about putting it where you're likely to quilt, since you'll be removing these pins as you quilt if they are in your way. Now you're going to do this now across the whole quilt, starting from the center moving down and then going back up so you have the entire quilt pin basted, at which point you're ready to move on. Now once the quilt is basted, gently lift it and check the back. Look for big folds or wrinkles. If you find one, fix it now. It's much easier to repin before quilting than to discover a pucker after you have lovingly sewed it into permanent history. And now the quilt sandwich is ready for the sewing machine. Now this step may not look as exciting as sewing colorful blocks together, but it matters. Good basting helps the quilting go more smoothly, and it helps prevent tucks and folds and puckers. Now next we're going to take our basted quilt top, batting and backing to the sewing machine, and we're going to quilt it with simple straight line quilting. You don't need a long arm. You can quilt this baby quilt on a regular home machine, one line at a time. But again, if you do want fancy quilt designs, like you see here, you can absolutely take them to a long arm quilter and have it do it for you, but you'll be amazed how sweet this quilt will look with simple straight line quilting. Now straight line quilting may be simple, but simple can be beautiful. For a first baby quilt, clean straight lines are more than enough. They hold the layers together, add texture, and let the fabric and the panel stay the focus. Before we start sewing, let's talk about thread. Now for the top thread, we want to choose a color that looks good on the quilt top. It can blend in if you want the quilting to be subtle, or it can contrast a little if you want the quilting to show. For beginner quilts, I usually recommend blending more than contrasting. If the thread color is close to your fabric colors, little wiggles in your quilting are much less dramatic. We're not trying to highlight every learning curve with neon thread. And so I have a couple options here. I have a light blue thread and I have a white thread. And I think, in fact, as I look at the thread and their spools, it's still a little hard to see. And so what I will do is I'll go ahead and unspool quite a bit of thread and just kind of puddle it on the quilt so I can see a little bit better how that thread's going to look. Now that's the white, do the blue. And I think as I look at this, it looks to me like the blue is blending in quite a great deal better than the white does. I like that against the border color much more than I like the white. The white's going to pop just a bit too much. So I'm going to go with this light blue for the top. Now for the bobbin thread, you want to think about your backing fabric. You can use the same thread in the bobbin as you use on the top, or you can choose a bobbin thread that blends better with the backing. If the top and bottom threads, however, are very different colors, you can find that tension issues will show much more easily. So for a first quilt, similar colors are a bit more forgiving. So I'm going to use the light blue in the bobbin as well. Now for a needle, you want to use a fresh needle. That matters more than you realize. A quilting needle, a university needle, or a top stitching needle can all work depending upon your machine. For many cotton quilts, something like an 80-12 or a 90-14 is a great place to start. If you have a walking foot, this is the time to use it. A walking foot helps feed the top layer and bottom layer more evenly, which can help reduce shifting. Now whether you're using a walking foot or a regular presser foot, you want to have one of these. It's a guide that slides into a hole in your foot and can be used to measure consistent straight line distances. I'll show you how to use this when we do our quilting. If you don't have a walking foot, you can still quilt the small quilt. Go slowly, baste well, support the quilt so it's not dragging, and guide gently without pulling. Now let's choose a quilting plan. For a first quilt, simple straight line quilting is perfect. You have several options. You can sew straight vertical lines. You can sew horizontal lines. You can do a simple grid or cross hatching. You can also do gentle wavy lines if straight lines make you tense. Or you can do slightly uneven organic lines, which is a fancy way of saying I meant to do that. All of these hold the quilt layers together and add texture. The goal is not perfect laser straight stitching. The goal is a quilt that is neat, sturdy, finished, and ready to be loved. Now for this quilt, I'm going to do a crosshatch design, but I'm going to do it on the diagonal. Now, if you use the guide that comes with your presser foot, you really only need to mark 2 lines for this design, 1 on each diagonal. Now there are several marking tools you can use on fabrics, but I like to use masking tape. I'm going to start by placing my first line at this corner, and I'm just going to run this whole tape across the diagonal, matching those corners where I know they are on the diagonal. Now this is a perfectly square quilt, so this should be pretty easy to do. And straight across. Now I'll do the other side just the same way, starting in the corner, matching each corner where it lands on the diagonal, then straight across and all the way to the other side. I'm just putting one side of the masking tape right where I'm going to sew, right on that line. Now once you have that secure, you actually want to break the tape in segments along that path. And that's because if the tape stays the entire distance of the quilt, it will start to pull it together, and we don't want that. So I'm just going to now go through and just use my fingers to break the tape so that there is plenty of room for the fabric to stretch and to move comfortably without necessarily roughing up the tape. And now we're ready to take it to our sewing machine. And now we're going to set up our machine. And the first thing I've done is I've put on my walking foot, and I've also put in my guide. And I currently have it set for about 1.5 inches. So that's how far apart my lines will be. I also like to increase my stitch length to about 3. So I'm just going to move that up until it's 3. And that's going to be my stitch length. I also want to make you aware of the needle down position. That basically puts the needle in the quilt so that when you move, it doesn't move the quilt around too. Now before quilting the real quilt, you want to test your thread, needle, and stitch length on a small quilt sandwich, which is basically scraps that you have made of the same batting and fabric. 2 pieces of fabric with batting in between. You're going to sew a few lines, then check the front and back. Now the stitches should look balanced. If you see loops, eyelashes, or bobbin thread pulling to the top, your tension may need adjusting. Now every machine is a little different, so this test is worth a minute or 2 that it takes. It's much better to argue with your tension on a scrap than in the middle of your new baby quilt. And now you're ready to sew. You're going to start a little before the fabric and then work your way in. Make sure you put your needle down so that it's holding the fabric for you. If you need to step away, the quilt won't move. I'm going to put my quilting gloves on because I do find them to be a little bit easier to move the quilt around. The downside is you usually have to take them off and on as you have to remove pins. Now we're going to stitch beside the edge of the tape. We're not going to sew through the tape, we're going to sew next to it. If you do happen to sew over it, no big deal, it still comes out, but you really want to ride that line that you made completely diagonal across the quilt. Now this quilt is small, so it is manageable, but even with this small quilt, try not to let the whole quilt hang off the table or pull against the needle, because it will still affect your stitch length even with a walking foot if it's pulling down. Now I just hopped off and put a pillow on my lap to help keep that quilt up a little bit higher so it's not dragging down. Now if you move on to larger quilts later, this becomes even more important. You may want to add an extra table, an ironing board, or a side surface near your machine so the quilt has somewhere to rest. Drag is one of the sneaky reasons that quilting can feel harder than it needs to. Now you're going to roll or fold the quilt so the part you're not stitching feeds comfortably within the throat of the machine. We're not stuffing the quilt through the machine, we're arranging it so we can work one line at a time. Now my quilting gloves are also helping. They give my hands a little grip so I can guide them in, but I do have to remove them in order to take out the pins along the way. They are optional, but if your hands feel like they're sliding around on the fabric, gloves can make the process feel much easier. You're not going to push the quilt, but you do need to steer the quilt to make sure you stay on your line. Now you saw that we're actually starting in the center of the quilt and working outward. And that helps any small shifting move towards the edges instead of getting trapped in the middle. So we're going to go all the way down on this diagonal, and then we're going to go all the way down on the other diagonal. The machine is moving the fabric under the feed dogs. Your job is to keep the layers supported and moving in the direction that you want. Now these first two lines we're doing can be a bit of a bother because you've got the tape to deal with, you've got your pins to deal with, you've got your gloves coming on and off, but be patient. These two lines are important because they set the stage for the rest of the quilt. So tolerate these first two lines and then the rest will go much easier. Now keep going till you get to the end of your first line. Now that we're done our first line, I'm going to go ahead and remove this tape. We no longer need it. And then we'll turn the quilt around and do our next diagonal line. We're going to do it exactly the same way. We're going to start a little before the fabric starts for the top, and then we're going to begin stitching. Make sure our needle is down in case we have to stop. We don't want the quilt to move around. And then we're just going to proceed to stitch down this line just like we did the last one. Now that we're done our second line, I'm going to remove the tape there as well, and now the tape is all gone. Now if you have this guide, you're just going to use that from here on in to measure your 1.5 inch distance. If you don't have that, it's okay. You're just going to take the quilt back to your table and put down more masking tape for each of the 1 and 1.5 inch lines that you want to sew. So now we are back. I'm going to use my guide. You can see I'm now going to put that so that it's literally riding on the first sewing line that I made, so that my next sewing line will be 1.5 inches from the first one. So starting a little before the quilt, make sure your guide is down. It helps if it's touching the quilt. Now you're just going to sew straight down this line. Keep quilting. So the spacing does not have to be perfect. Consistent enough is fine for your first quilt. It will look beautiful regardless, trust me. You're going to keep quilting one line at a time, working outward from the center. Each time it gets a little bit easier because you have less quilt within the throat of your machine. Now once you reach the end of your first side, you're going to turn the quilt. You're going to turn the quilt and then you're going to go the same diagonal, but this time on the other side of your center line. And as before, you'll go all the way to the end. Now you can see I occasionally bring my ruler out and recheck the distance on my guide. That way I'm sure it hasn't shifted as I'm moving the quilt around. We do want that spacing to be even throughout the entire quilt. Now when you're done that side, you're going to take the quilt and pivot it. So now you're going to do the diagonal in the other direction. And so you're going to find your original line that you had made and you're going to put your guide on it. And now you're going to start sewing in the opposite direction that you have been sewing before. And you're going to do the rest of your cross hatching. Just like before, keep your guide on that line and do your quilting line by line all the way through until you've completed the entire left-hand side. Okay, doesn't that look great? And now you're ready to turn it around and do the remaining quarter of your quilt. Put that right back on the original center line, and now you're going to do the other side, the final side of the quilt, and keep going line by line until you reach the end of the quilt. Ta-da! Doesn't that look gorgeous? There's just something about diagonal cross hatching. It looks fantastic. Now, you may not be able to see it, but I got plenty of wobbles in here. My problem, it's always hard for me to concentrate on a single line. My mind wanders and off I go wobbling around, but the truth is you don't even see it. Now, there is some fluff from the batting. You can just take a lint remover and pull that off, but that looks just fantastic. Now you want to just turn it over and take a look at the back. Now small imperfections are normal. Big folds are worth fixing. You can just take out your seam ripper and take those out and redo those lines. But frankly, this just looks fantastic. So hopefully you're very proud and happy with your quilt. And now we're going to move on to finishing it with the binding. Now that the quilting is finished, we need to trim the quilt. Now I'm going to use my ruler and I'm going to go up this first side and measure how much of the border that I have after the piece block and find a distance that is the minimum distance that I'm finding across the whole side. And then I'm going to cut along that line. In my case, it's 3 inches from the piece border. The reason we're doing that way is to make sure that we have a consistent distance across the outer perimeter of the quilt. So take your time here. A clean edge will make the binding easier. So continue around all 4 sides. And at the corner, we're just going to flip our ruler around and continue along the next side. And do that through the 4 sides of the quilt. Now once all 4 sides are trimmed, the quilt has a clean edge and is ready for binding. Binding is the fabric strip that wraps around the raw edge of the quilt and gives it a finished edge. Right now the edge of the quilt has quilt top, batting, and backing all exposed. The binding covers those raw edges and frames the quilt. Now binding is both practical and decorative. It protects the edges of the quilt, which get a lot of wear, but it also acts like a picture frame. The color you choose for binding can make it feel calm, bold, playful, or finished in a very quiet way. Which is what we're going to do here by using the same fabric that we have in our borders as our binding fabric. It's not going to make a bold statement, but it's going to give the quilt a frame, but also some continuity. Now the first thing I'm going to show you is how to attach your binding strips. Our pattern calls for 4 strips of fabric for the binding, but we ultimately need 1 long binding strip instead of these 4 separate pieces. And we're going to join the strips together using the diagonal method. This is helpful because it spreads the seams out so you don't get one bulky lump in your binding. It makes this easier to sew, especially if you're using a regular presser foot instead of a walking foot. Now let me show you how that's done. So we have our first piece, which is the one that's pointing to the left, and the second piece is the one that's on top and pointing down. And so we are going to create a diagonal line there to sew on. Let me show you a close-up. Now we want them slightly overlapping, and I'm going to place my ruler right at the intersection of those pieces, and I'm just going to draw a straight line. That's the line I'm going to sew on. Now you can put a pin in if you like just to keep it steady, but what you want to be able to do now is go to your machine and sew right on that line, basically sewing those 2 pieces of binding together. Now we want to sew the next one to our second piece. So I'm going to move it out and then flip it over. And this way I've got my right side facing up again. I'm going to take my 3rd strip and I'm going to put it right over the top at a 90-degree angle. I'm going to do the same thing. Overlap it just a little bit, draw my line, and then go ahead and sew on that line. Now I'm going to do that move again. I'm going to take the strip, move it over to my left, flip it over, then put it back down, right side facing up, take my next strip, place it over the top at a right angle, slightly overlapping, and draw my line. Now we're going to sew on that final line, and we've got our 4 strips now sewn together. And now I'm going to take my scissors and cut the threads between my pieces, and I'm now going to trim the excess. We're just going to trim about 1/4 inch. Does not have to be perfect, but we're just going to trim that excess off so it doesn't make our seams too bulky. We'll do that for each of the 3 pieces, and then we'll take it to the ironing board to press. Now, starting at one end of my binding, I'm going to fold it over, and then using my iron, I'm going to go ahead and press that down. So we want a nice flat folded piece of 2.5 inch binding, and that's what we're going to use to seal over the edge of our quilt. Now just go along the entire piece and continue to fold and press. And when you come up to one of the seams that you have created, just press that down and then continue to fold it over and press it. So ultimately you'll have one long strip of folded fabric. Now the binding is ready to attach to the quilt. Next, we'll sew it to the quilt, turn it around the edge, and stitch it down. Many quilters have strong feelings about hand binding versus machine binding. Hand binding can be beautiful and relaxing, but machine binding is sturdy, practical, and very beginner friendly. Now for a baby quilt that may be loved, washed, and used, sturdy is a wonderful thing. And now we're ready to attach the binding. So you have your one long strip of binding, you have your quilted baby quilt, and you are ready to attach the two. So I want to say right away, binding can feel awkward the first time you do it. Doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. It means that you're learning. And this is the part where the fabric has to wrap around the edge, turn corners, and behave itself. And fabric does not always do that. Now there are many ways to bind a quilt. You'll find lots of different ways of doing so on the internet. What I'm going to show you is to be able to bind the quilt from the back, and we're going to machine bind the quilt. And I do that especially for baby quilts because they go through a lot of washing and we want them to be really sturdy. So we're going to do this from the back side first, and then we're going to flip the binding over and do the front. Now, you want to make sure you have your walking foot if you have one. If not, go ahead and use your regular pressure foot, but go slow. Now we're going to start this in the middle of one side of the quilt, not at a corner. And we're going to place the raw edges of the folded binding along the raw edge of the quilt. So the folded edge of the binding points towards the inside of the quilt, and the raw edges of the binding line up with the raw edge of the quilt. Now we're going to leave a generous tail before we start sewing, about 8 to 10 inches if you can. We need that extra length later when we join and overlap the edges. So we're going to begin sewing the binding to the front of the quilt with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You should see that marking right on your presser foot. Now you can pull your binding, just lay it on the top of your quilt, or you can leave it on the floor behind you. We just want to make sure it's not being pulled. Sew slowly and keep the raw edges aligned. Now when we get close to the corner, we're going to stop about 1 inch from the bottom, and we're going to use our ruler to mark 1/4 inch from the bottom and place a mark right in the seam allowance section of your quilt, just enough that you can see it and know to stop there as you're sewing. Now I'm going to show you how to do a mitered corner binding. When you get to a corner with your binding, the trick is to stop a little before the edge so the binding has room to fold. As you sew towards the corner, keep the raw edges of the binding lined up with the raw edges of the quilt, and when you're about 1/4 inch from the corner, do a back stitch to secure it, then stop sewing. That 1/4 inch stopping point is what gives the binding room to fold neatly. Now fold the binding strip straight up away from the quilt. This creates a diagonal fold at the corner. Then fold the binding back down along the neck side of the quilt, lining the raw edges up again. Now you can start sewing down the next side. That fold up, fold down motion is what creates the mitered corner. And if it feels a little awkward the first time, that's completely normal. Binding corners are tiny fabric origami. And now we're going to do that on our own quilt. So I marked that 1/4 inch. Now I'm going to transfer that mark to the top piece of binding right in the seam allowance, just enough that I can see it. Then I'm going to sew to that 1/4 inch mark and backstitch. Now you don't have to cut your thread, but I do find it helpful to do so. So I'm going to do that. And now I'll show you that fun little origami movement. So now take your binding, you're going to fold it to the right, create that diagonal seam. Basically you're going to hit that corner. Then you're going to fold it back up and across the other side. And you've created that very nice diagonal. Now make sure the fold you created is exactly on that seam allowance. Now you can put a pin in it if you like, but I'm just going to pivot it around and then start sewing. I'm just going to start sewing my 1/4 inch seam allowance and now continue on the rest of that side of the quilt. And we're going to do that in every corner. Now we're coming up to our next corner, so I'm going to take out my ruler and mark that 1/4 inch from the bottom right in the seam allowance, just so that I can see it. And then I'll put the binding down and transfer that same marking to the top, again in the seam allowance. And then I'll go forward to that 1/4 inch mark and backstitch. Now we're going to remove it and do our little origami movement again. And we're going to fold it so that we create a diagonal right along that line, right to the corner. And then we're going to fold it so that our fold is right on the edge of that quilt. And we're ready to now pivot it and sew. Now you're going to repeat this around all 4 corners. Sew to a 1/4 inch from the corner, fold up, fold down, and keep going. Now when you come back near where you started, you're going to stop with enough space to deal with the 2 binding tails. Now there's several ways to join binding ends. Some are very tidy and some are more advanced. I'm going to show you a very traditional diagonal binding method. Now once you've come back around to where you started, you can join the 2 binding tails with diagonal seams. This gives you a neater finish and less bulk than a simple overlap. So you're going to leave an opening between where you started sewing and where you stopped, usually between 12 to 14 inches. Now you should have 2 loose binding tails. The first thing you're going to do is overlap the tails by the width of your binding strip. For this quilt, our binding is 2.5 inches wide, so the tail should overlap by 2.5 inches. We usually trim a little bit less than the 2.5 inches to give it a little extra snugness. So we're then going to trim away any extra, and now we're going to open the binding tails flat. We are going to put them together so the 2 ends are right sides together at a right angle, so they make an L shape. This part can feel a little strange the first time, but the right angle setup is what lets the binding become one continuous strip. Now mark a diagonal line across the overlap, sew on the diagonal line, And before trimming, check that the binding opens out straight and is not twisted. Once it looks right, trim the extra fabric away, leaving about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Press or finger press the seam, fold the binding back into shape, and lay it against the quilt edge. The binding should now fit the opening smoothly, and now sew the remaining section to the quilt. Remember to overlap by a little less than the width of the binding. Place the ends right side together at a right angle, sew diagonally, and check before you trim. I have overlapped the tails, and now I'm going to use the width of my binding strip to cut them so that they overlap by exactly 2.5 inches. So I can just use a pin to mark where this binding ends, and then measure 2.5 inches over, and that's where I want this bottom binding to be cut. Now generally you want this to be in the center of the spacing that you've made to bring the two pieces of binding together. Now that I have them marked, I can remove my 2.5 inch piece. Now when you cut, you actually want to cut about a 1/4 of an inch before your measurement. That would make the piece just a little bit shorter, and this means when you do join those two pieces, you don't have any extra slack in your binding. It'll be nice and tight and snug. And now we're going to open up the tails and place them right sides together so that we can sew them. Now the way that I do that to make it easier for me is I will take the right side and I will just kind of scrunch it up over here and point it at a 90-degree angle from the quilt, and then I'm going to pin it so that it stays in that position. Now I'm going to go over to my other side and open that one up as well. Now I will take the quilt and kind of scrunch it up like this to bring those two pieces together so that I can mark them and pin them correctly. I'll just put a pin in here so it stays there while I'm doing this piece. Now go back to my strip on the left, and I'm going to flip it over so that these two pieces are right side together, but you'll notice they're at a 90-degree angle from each other. So this is exactly like we'd sewn our binding strips together at the beginning. Now we're doing it to join the two at the very end. Now that I have them one over the top of the other, I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing. I'm going to draw that diagonal line using my ruler from one end to the other. Let me put a pin so it doesn't get away while I'm trying to do this. And take my ruler and mark from corner to corner. And this is the line that we're going to sew on to join these two. Now you can just take these whole things right back to your sewing machine. You can leave it pinned so it doesn't wiggle away while you're trying to sew, and you're going to sew right on that line. So once we finish sewing them together, we're going to go ahead and remove our pins. We no longer need those. And now pull it out and just double check it looks like it lies flat. That tells you that you sewed them together correctly. If you are satisfied, go ahead, take your scissors and just trim off all but a 1/4 inch. And now we're ready to start sewing the remainder of the binding to the quilt. Now our binding looks great now from the back. Now we're going to flip the quilt over and sew the binding to the front. Now if you do have clips, this is a time when they really are especially handy. You can use them to hold the binding in place while you stitch it down. We're going to start by rolling the binding over to the top, and then we can clip that down. You want it relatively even, so normally you butt it right up against the edge of that quilt, and then just pin it down or clip it down a couple places. and then you're going to remove those clips as you go along. Now you want to do this really slowly, especially if you're not working with a walking foot, because if you thought it was thick before, it's even thicker now because it has the folded binding in place. So you want to line that up so that your presser foot is just a little bit in from where the binding connects with the quilt top. And you can see that better here. I'm actually putting the left side of my rolled binding right up against the left side of the opening in my presser foot, and that way I'm pretty much guaranteed an equal seam across the front of that binding. Now I do back stitch here, just make sure it's secure, and then I am going to go ahead and sew right down the side of that quilt, keeping the distance between the presser foot and the edge of the binding consistent so that it will look very nice from the front. And then as you're going through, certainly as you're just getting started, it pays to kind of take a peek behind you, look at how that seam is looking, make sure it looks good on both sides, you're happy where it's landing, and then you can go ahead and keep going. Now I don't clip the whole thing before I sit down to start sewing my binding. I put in clips as I go along, and so that way when I reach the point where I have no more clips, I'll pause, I'll make sure my needle is in the down position so it's holding the quilt, and then I will go ahead and do some more folding and put the clips on, and then proceed to continue sewing down the side. Now when you come to a corner, you're going to slow down. You're going to keep the needle down, and then I'm going to show you how to fold up that corner so it looks very tidy on the quilt and will stay securely. So as you get close, simply hold down the right side, the side you're sewing, and then flip up the bottom so it now rolls over to the top, and you will find you have a very nice corner there. Let me show you that a little bit more closely. Now I'm doing this one-handed because I'm holding the camera with the other, but you simply fold it up. You're going to create a little tuck there, your little diagonal, and now you're ready to start sewing. You're just going to sew right over the top of that, pivot, and then sew down the other side. Now let me show you that here. I'm going to stitch right up and over the folded binding on the bottom so that I have stitched a couple stitches into it. Keep the needle down. And now you should be able to turn your quilt, and this is a great time to pause and take a look how your stitching is looking. Now it doesn't have to be perfect, and it probably won't be if this is your first time, and maybe if it's your 20th time, but you should be able to see that your stitching is coming out pretty even as you're going down that seam. Kind of helps keep it nice and tidy. Remember, this is handmade, so it's not supposed to be perfect. It's supposed to be lovingly made, and that's what you're doing. So now you're going to keep going down the next side, put your clips in, and then keep going down until you reach the next corner, and you're going to do the same thing. Now we're at our next corner, just as before. You may want to clip some threads here if you have them. And now you're ready to do the same thing where you're going to fold it over. You'll find there's a lot of threads in making quilts. And you're going to fold it over, do the flip, and then again sew over the top of the binding around that corner, just a couple stitches, and then keep your needle down, turn the quilt, and you're ready to go on the next side. And you don't have to use clips if you find that they are not needed. Feel free to use your hands just to hold it down, whatever makes you comfortable. You can also take the whole thing to the ironing board and just iron the binding down in a folded position, whatever works best for you. And now as you come to the very end, you're going to come to that part where you started. There's no magic here. Just take out any of our extra strings, and then you're just going to sew right to where you started. So it's one continuous seam. You can just back stitch here, make sure it stays nice and tight, doesn't go anywhere, and you're done. Now you probably have a lot of threads everywhere, so take time to kind of go through your quilt, cut all your extra threads, and you're ready to start showing it off. Now, if you like, you can add a label, take a picture, share it on your Facebook page for your friends to see. If this is your first quilt, I hope you take a moment to really see what you've made. Now, don't look first for the imperfect seam or the corner you wish was different. Look at the whole quilt. You made something useful, soft, personal, and full of care. That is the heart of quilting. So thank you for sewing along with me. I hope this helped you feel like quilting is something you can completely do. Don't forget to like and subscribe to see more of our quilting videos.
Quilting every day, quilting.